You are not addicted to cigarettes, alcohol, pornography, or sugar. You are addicted to escape. What we call addiction is just the shell, the visible surface of a much deeper hole. Addiction is just the symptom of pain that has never been named. Gabor Maté reveals, addiction is not the problem. It is the attempt to escape it that reveals the real human drama. Addiction, then, is not an irrational choice. It is an emotional adaptation, an automatic response to emotional suffering that has become unbearable. It is the body screaming for relief when the soul is tired of asking for help. If this topic makes sense to you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. But why is this an illusion? Because addiction pretends to be medicine. It offers control, pleasure, distraction, but it comes at a very high price: your freedom. Addiction is a business where you pay with your peace to avoid your pain. And the more you try to get rid of addiction without understanding what sustains it, the stronger it gets. It's like trying to put out a fire by blowing on the smoke. It's not about willpower. It's not about discipline. The root is elsewhere: older, quieter, more emotional. As long as we see addiction as the central problem, we continue to fight a losing battle. We only change the disguise of the escape, without ever touching the wound that motivated it. This is the first paradigm shift. Addiction is an adaptation, a desperate strategy for self-preservation. It is the mind trying to survive when the pain is greater than it can bear, and that changes everything. Because instead of attacking the behavior, we begin to investigate its origin. And those who investigate deeply discover something disconcerting. Addiction is not the disease. It is the symptom of the absence of a cure. No one wakes up one day and decides to destroy their own life. Every addiction begins as a whisper of relief. Behind every compulsion, there is pain screaming in silence. This pain is not born of addiction. It precedes it. It sustains it. It is important to understand. Addiction is not an attraction to pleasure. It is a repulsion to pain, an old pain, sometimes forgotten but never resolved. Gabor Maté states, the question is not why addiction, but why pain? And that change in question changes everything. When a child grows up in an environment where they cannot be fully accepted, where they need to hide parts of themselves to be loved, they learn to numb themselves. When there is no safe space to express fear, anger, sadness, or confusion, the body stores these emotions as toxic burdens, and what is not emotionally digested silently rots. Later, the mind finds ways to protect itself, some harmless, others destructive, but all with one goal: to escape the original pain. Alcohol, food, sex, success, performance, control, all of these can become crutches for those who can no longer bear to suffer. What begins as a survival strategy gradually turns into a prison, and the cell is not made of substances. It is made of unresolved emotions. That's why trying to overcome addiction without facing the pain is like pruning leaves without pulling out the roots. It works for a while, but then everything comes back. The pain that precedes the habit needs to be seen, felt, and understood. Not fought, not denied, not rationalized. Because what heals is not strength. It is presence. It is the courage to look into your own abyss and not look away. And that brings us to a new question. If addiction is an escape, why does it seem to work so well? Addiction is deceiving. It disguises itself as relief, but it is just another way of postponing the inevitable. When someone sinks into addiction, the common reaction is to judge, lacks character, lacks discipline, lacks willpower. But no one really wants to destroy themselves. The truth is more complex and more human. Addiction seems to work because for a moment it silences the internal chaos. It's a pause button on pain. For a few minutes, hours, or days, everything seems under control. Anxiety subsides, sadness recedes, distress disappears. That's why addiction is addictive, not because of the pleasure it offers, but because of the relief it promises. The problem is that this escape has a rebound effect. The more you run away, the more the pain builds up. And the more it accumulates, the stronger the need to escape again. That's the cycle. Pain, relief, guilt, repetition, and the brain gets used to the immediate reward. It learns that instead of facing it, it's easier to numb it. Addiction isn't stubbornness, it's neuroscience. It's the nervous system looking for an escape route that works now, even if it destroys you later. And the more society reinforces this logic, produce more, feel less, be strong, never vulnerable, the more it pushes people into increasingly subtle and normalized addictions. Addiction is no longer the exception. It becomes the rule. It becomes culture. Social media, compulsive shopping, obsession with performance, codependent relationships. All of these can be an escape. But as long as it works, no one calls it a problem. And that's the point. Addiction doesn't seem like the villain. It seems like a friend, a refuge, a relief, until one day it demands everything it promised you. That's why identifying addiction isn't about looking at the behavior itself, but at what it hides, at the emptiness it fills, at the cry it silences. And when you start to hear that cry, the question changes. Where, after all, does this pain we try so hard to escape come from? The origin of most addictions is not in youth. It's in childhood. It doesn't start with the first dose. It starts with the first unhealed emotional wound. Gabor Maté is blunt. All self-destructive behavior carries traces of a disconnected childhood, not necessarily marked by explicit abuse, but almost always by invisible absences. A child doesn't have to be abused to be hurt. It's enough to grow up in an environment where they are not seen, where their feelings are ignored, where their pain is minimized, where they need to be something different to deserve love. Trauma is not what happens to you. It is what happens inside you as a result of what happened outside. This early disconnection creates a deep void, a void that later tries to be filled by any external stimulus: pleasure, consumption, distraction, control. Addiction is the continuation of an interrupted childhood. The child who couldn't cry learns to be silent. The child who wasn't welcomed learns to numb themselves. And emotional anesthesia, over time, becomes dependence. Dependence on dopamine, on acceptance, on validation, on anything that fills the hole left by the lack of true connection. And the more sophisticated the escape, the harder it is to notice, because the functional, productive, and even successful adult may just be wearing an elegant mask over their trauma. Many addictions are not born out of mistakes, but out of the attempt to get it right, to be loved, accepted, enough. And the body carries that memory. The mind may forget, but the body does not. That is why understanding childhood is not about blaming parents. It's about mapping the voids that shape the way you exist. Addiction, then, ceases to be an act of weakness. It becomes a delayed cry for connection. And if it all starts way back there, the question that arises now is inevitable. What is society doing to heal or perpetuate this disconnection? We live in a culture that profits from your escape. Modern society doesn't just ignore emotional pain, it turns it into a market. Advertisements promise instant happiness. Apps offer constant distraction. Social media delivers daily doses of comparison and dopamine. Everything revolves around more consumption, more productivity, more performance. But no one asks, more for whom? Gabor Maté says we live in a system that promotes discomfort as the norm and addiction as anesthesia. We are taught to function, not to feel. We are molded to perform, not to know ourselves. It is a society that idolizes the mind and abandons the body, that romanticizes excess and calls any pause a failure. In this scenario, addiction becomes almost inevitable, because running away becomes easier than stopping, and distracting yourself is more accessible than listening to yourself. The problem is not only with the individual who suffers, but with the environment that produces this mass suffering. We live in an emotionally toxic ecosystem, where connection is superficial and inner silence is unbearable. Addiction, therefore, is not a deviation from the system. It is a byproduct of the system. We are encouraged from an early age to deny our vulnerabilities, to compete for love, to hide our emotions to appear strong. And when this builds up, addiction appears as an escape valve. What should be the exception has become the norm. Working too much, eating when we're not hungry, buying things we don't need, scrolling aimlessly on our phones. All of this is addiction, but no one calls it that, because it's profitable. And if society rewards escape, who will want to face the pain? This is the paradox. We are sickened by an environment that rewards disconnection, and those who try to heal are seen as weak, slow, strange. In this context, a new question arises. What happens when addiction ceases to be marginal and becomes invisible? Not all addiction smells like alcohol or looks like crack. Some wear suits, others have degrees. Many receive likes. The most dangerous addictions are not the forbidden ones. They are the ones that are applauded. Working 14 hours a day, checking your cell phone every 3 minutes, seeking approval with every post, living by goals, metrics, and external validation. It looks like success, but often it's just ambition disguised as escape. Gabor Maté warns, what determines whether something is an addiction is not the substance. It's the impact it has on your life. It's how much it distances you from yourself. You can be addicted to control, productivity, praise. You can always be busy so you're never alone, always available to the world, and absent from yourself. These addictions are invisible because they feed the ego, not the soul. They maintain appearances while corroding the essence. They are addictions that don't cause overdose, but they cause emptiness. They don't destroy you all at once, but they silence you little by little. And the more they become the cultural norm, the harder it is to see them as a problem. A person who lives to work is rarely called an addict. They are called an example. But inside, they feel the same emptiness, the same anxiety, the same disconnect that exists in an alcoholic or a heroin user. The form changes, but the function is identical, to numb. And as long as this is ignored, the cycle repeats itself. Because the name of the addiction doesn't matter. What matters is what it tries to hide. When escape is socially accepted, healing becomes counterintuitive. It requires swimming against the tide, questioning what everyone applauds. And that brings us to an inevitable point. The body knows the truth that the mind tries to camouflage. The mind can lie, but the body never forgets. Every emotion that is not felt becomes tension. Every pain that is ignored becomes a symptom. Every truth that is repressed becomes a disease. Gabor Maté states, trauma is not in the event, but in what it does to the body and the nervous system. In other words, what you don't resolve emotionally, the body takes on as a biological burden. Chronic migraines, insomnia, autoimmune diseases, recurrent gastritis. Often all of this is not random. It is the body trying to say what the mind insists on silencing. And when we don't listen, it screams. With pain, with illness, with addictions. Because addiction is also a physical cry. It's how the nervous system tries to regulate an internal emotional imbalance. It's the brain chemistry trying to survive the absence of emotional security. Those who live in a constant state of alert do not feel peace. And without peace, any relief becomes dependence. The problem is that we have been taught to treat the body like a machine. Medicine for pain, coffee for tiredness, stimulation for sadness. But the body is not stupid. It is wise. It is honest. Every symptom has a message. Every tension has a story. As long as we continue to ignore the body, we will continue to treat symptoms and feed addictions, because addiction is also a reflection of what has been denied, and denying pain does not erase it. It only pushes it inside until it turns into illness or compulsion. Healing begins when you listen, when you stop controlling and start feeling. But for that to happen, a radical change is needed. Stop fighting addiction and start understanding what it is trying to tell you. This shift leads us to a new understanding. What if the key is not in control, but in understanding? The biggest lie about addiction is this, that you need more control, more willpower, more discipline, more resistance. But controlling addiction is like trying to put out a fire with a glass of water. It's not strength that solves it, it's understanding. Gabor Maté debunks the myth of willpower, because addiction is not a moral weakness, it's an emotional adaptation. You didn't consciously choose it or ton. It was built by the conditions that shaped you. So why do we treat it as if it were just an individual choice? Recovery begins when you stop blaming yourself and start listening to yourself. When you trade the whip for curiosity. When instead of asking, how do I stop, and you start asking, why did I start? Understanding addiction is looking at it like a map. Every impulse hides a path of pain. Each relapse points to an unmet need. It's not about eliminating the behavior. It's about listening to what it reveals. Because addiction speaks of your pain, but also of your deepest need to reconnect. That's where the turning point lies. You don't cure addiction by fighting the behavior. You cure it by creating an internal environment where it is no longer necessary. And that takes courage. Courage to get out of autopilot. Courage to feel what you once numbed. Understanding is not justifying. It is illuminating. It is seeing the human being behind the label of addict. It is discovering that most of the time, we are not dealing with someone who is weak, but with someone who has carried too much pain for too long, too alone. And from there, something new is born. The possibility of facing the original pain, of no longer running away, of facing with presence what has been avoided for so long. But for that, a rare gesture is needed. The courage to feel, even when everything in you wants to run away. Running away is easy. Feeling is brutal. But it is in feeling that healing begins. There is no true recovery without pain, because there is no healing without contact with the wound. Addiction is emotional armor. It protects you from what you believe you cannot bear. But over time, this protection becomes a prison. Gabor Maté states, "True liberation is not in overcoming addiction, but in reconnecting with who you are without it." And who you are is someone who feels. The pain you avoid does not disappear. It accumulates. It expresses itself in other ways. It manifests itself in symptoms, in anxiety, in existential emptiness. Feeling is an act of courage because it breaks down defenses. It leaves you naked in front of emotions you have hidden for years, and no one teaches you how to deal with that. But it is only there, in that raw and real territory, that something true happens. You begin to see yourself honestly, not as someone weak, but as someone human. Pain ceases to be the enemy. It becomes a guide. It shows you where the connection was broken. It points to what you still need to embrace. It teaches you to be whole, even with scars. That's when addiction loses its power, because you stop needing to run away. You start allowing yourself to exist with everything you feel: sadness, anger, fear, love, without judgment, without hiding, without numbing yourself. And it's this practice, simple but revolutionary, that breaks the cycle. Because when pain is truly felt, it no longer needs to be repeated. The courage to feel is the bridge between trauma and freedom. It's the hardest step, but it's also the most transformative. And from there, a new question arises. If I no longer need to run away, what does it mean to be free? Freedom is not the absence of pain. It is the total presence of it, without needing to run away. Addiction is the absence of connection. Freedom is reconnecting with everything that has been denied, silenced, ignored. Gabor Maté shows us that true healing does not lie in controlling the impulse, but in dissolving the emptiness that feeds it. And that emptiness can only be filled with presence, with connection, with emotional truth. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. It is connection. Connection with your own body, with previously repressed feelings, with people who are able to listen without judging, with an environment that does not demand performance but authenticity. When this connection happens, addiction loses its function. It no longer serves as a crutch, because now there is ground. There is internal space to sustain what once seemed unbearable. This does not mean the absence of relapses. It means the absence of self-abandonment. Real freedom is born when you stop fighting against yourself, when you stop negotiating with pain, and start dialoguing with it. And finally, you understand. Addiction was not the problem. It was your attempt to survive when no one taught you how to live truthfully. This awareness transforms everything, because it takes the focus off the symptom and leads to the source. And by accessing that source, you not only heal, you reframe who you are. You stop being someone trying to beat addiction, and you become someone whole, even with your shadows, your pains, and your limits. That is real freedom, not that of a body without addictions, but of a soul that no longer needs to run away. And now that everything has been exposed, I leave you with a final provocation. If addiction is an escape from pain, what would you do today if you had the courage to feel, instead of running away? If this content made sense to you, like the video, share your perspective, your experience, or your own journey in the comments. Let's turn pain into awareness, and awareness into connection.